alias El Lobo, testificó en contra de Genaro García Luna allá en la corte de Brooklyn, en Nueva York, y delató a rivales y exaliados del cártel de Sinaloa y de otros cárteles como en el que él lideraba, el del Milenio.
Oscar Nava Valencia became the leader of the Millennial Cartel and started smuggling drugs into the U.S. Who would have thought that a boy from an avocado farming family would turn out to be a cartel boss and a key witness at the same time? These are cartel members who outlived insane prison sentences.
The Department of Justice says Rafael Caro Quintero was known as the narco of narcos. He is the drug lord behind the killing of a U.S. federal agent.
A notorious Mexican drug lord convicted of the torture and murder of a United States anti-drugs agent in 1985 has been released from prison.
August 9th, 2013, Rafael Caro Quintero walked out of a Mexican prison after 28 years, leaving everyone wondering how a man sentenced to 40 years for murder could slip free with over a decade still hanging over his head. The details of how he became a free man after such a long sentence are truly shocking. Quintero is a notorious drug lord, once the kingpin of the Guadalajara cartel. He wouldn't just survive behind bars, he outsmarted the system that tried to hold him, sparking outrage and disbelief across two nations. Back in the 1970s, he helped build the Guadalajara cartel into a powerhouse, flooding the U.S. with marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. He was a big deal, ruthless, rich, and untouchable. Until 1985. That year he crossed a line that would haunt him. He was tied to the kidnapping, torture, and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, and the fallout that followed was massive. The U.S. pushed hard for his arrest, which eventually made Mexico arrest him in Costa Rica, dragging him back to face justice. A Mexican court hit him with a 40-year sentence for murder, and it seemed like the end of the road for the narco of narcos. But prison didn't break him. The Guadalajara cartel splintered, giving rise to groups like the Sinaloa cartel, with Caro Quintero's influence lingering. Now some say he kept running things through his family members, maybe laundering millions via legit-looking businesses like gas stations and real estate. Others argue that he faded into the background, too old and worn to matter. Either way, he did stay alive and kicking, biding his time. Then came the twist nobody saw coming. August 9th, 2013, a state judge in Jalisco, Rosalia Isabel Moreno Ruiz, suddenly ordered his release under a technicality claim. Now, she ruled that Caro Quintero's trial should have happened in a state court, not a federal one, since murder was a state crime back then. After 28 years spending about 70% of his sentence, he was free. Just like that, he walks out of Puente Grande in the early morning hours, vanishing before anyone could blink. The U.S. was furious, calling it a betrayal, while Mexico's government scrambled to save face. A higher court quickly said that the release was wrong, but it was too late. Mexico's justice system in the 80s and 90s was a mess, full of gaps that a slick lawyer could exploit. Caro Quintero's team found one: the argument that his federal trial was invalid. That plus 28 years already served gave the judge enough to cut him loose. Critics screamed corruption, pointing to the Sabadazo, a sneaky Saturday release when no one's watching. But there's no hard proof that bribes changed hands. What's clear is he played the game better than the system expected. Now, after his release, Quintero didn't just sit back. The U.S. says he went back into the drug game, leading a chunk of the Sinaloa cartel and sparking a turf war in Sonora. Mexico caught him again in 2022, but even now, Quintero is still fighting extradition with new legal tricks, winning suspensions to stay put. June 1995, Hector Luis Palma Salazar's private jet crash-landed in Mexico. Little did he know that this would be the beginning of a decades-long struggle that would test the limits of his survival behind bars. Known as El Güero Palma, this Sinaloa cartel co-founder faced insane prison sentences on both sides of the border. June 23, 1995, Palma was on his way to a wedding, disguised as a federal judicial police officer, complete with a fake ID and an armed caravan. The jet went down, but he survived, only to be arrested by Mexican military officers. That arrest kicked off a wild ride. First, he was extradited to the U.S. in 2007, facing a 16-year sentence for drug trafficking. But here's the twist: he got out early. June 2016, after serving just 9 years, El Güero Palma was released from prison thanks to good behavior. 9 years in a max security prison like Atwater in California is no joke. Constant lockdowns, isolation, and the threat of violence from inmates or guards. Yet Palma walked out. However, the second he landed back in Mexico, authorities hit him with a double homicide charge tied to the 1995 murders of 2 Nayarit police officers. Back to prison he went, this time to Altiplano, Mexico's toughest lockup near Mexico City. Now, Altiplano's a dangerous place. It's where El Chapo had famously escaped in 2015, only for Palma to sit tight and survive its brutal conditions. Years dragged on, with legal battles piling up. 2021, a judge acquitted him of organized crime charges, and he briefly tasted freedom, only to be rearrested hours later on new murder charges. Each time it seemed like the system wanted to drown him, but Palma kept his head above the water.
Es el momento en el que el narcotraficante Fabio Ochoa llega a Colombia.
Bienvenido, Fabio, bienvenido, bienvenido.
Él es líder de una de las organizaciones.
December 3rd, 2024, Fabio Ochoa Vasquez walked out of a U.S. federal prison, a free man, after serving 25 years of a 30-year sentence, leaving the world to wonder how this infamous Medellin cartel drug lord managed to outlast such a grueling punishment. His story is a wild ride of crime, captivity, and survival that feels almost too crazy to be real. Vasquez didn't exactly start life on the streets, but by the late 1970s, he was neck-deep in the drug trade, running a cocaine distribution hub in Miami for the Medellin cartel, alongside his brothers, Jorge Luis and Juan David, and their notorious boss, Pablo Escobar. Now, this wasn't small-time stuff. The cartel was pumping tons of cocaine into the U.S., raking in so much cash that the Ochoa brothers landed on the Forbes billionaire list from 1987 to 1992. Fabio, often seen as the chief executive of the family's operation, was living large until the law caught up. January 1991, Fabio got his first brush with prison when he and his brothers surrendered to Colombian authorities under a deal that promised no extradition to the U.S. Now, they served about 6 years and walked free in 1996, thinking they dodged the worst. But Fabio couldn't stay out of the game. October 20th, 1999, he was busted again in Colombia for helping with cocaine shipments. And in 2001, he was extradited to the U.S. to face a Miami indictment. Over 40 others were nabbed in that sweep, but Fabio stood out. He refused to cut a deal and took his chances at trial. That gamble landed him a 30-year sentence in 2003 for trafficking, conspiracy, and distribution. Interestingly, though, Fabio didn't serve the full 30 years. Good behavior shaved off enough time to get him out after 25. A feat that's rare for someone with his criminal history. On December 3rd, 2024, it would mark the end of that stretch, and at 67 years old, he stepped into freedom, handed over to U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement for deportation back to Colombia. August 23rd, 2021. Eduardo Arellano Felix steps off a plane in Mexico, a free man after years behind bars in the U.S. But what happened next would shock even the most hardened cartel member. Once dubbed El Doctor, Eduardo Arellano Felix was not a small player in the drug business. This guy was a kingpin in the Arellano Felix organization, a cartel that ruled the drug trade along the U.S.-Mexico border with an iron fist in the 90s. Interestingly, he was a medical doctor by training and wasn't out there pulling the trigger like his brother Ramon, the enforcer who got gunned down by police in 2002. Instead, Eduardo was the brains, laundering hundreds of millions in drug money, paying off cartel members, and keeping the operation moving. October 25th, 2008, Eduardo got arrested in Tijuana after a shootout. He was then extradited to the U.S. in 2012, and by 2013, he was staring down a 15-year sentence for money laundering and conspiracy. That could have been the end of it. A long stretch in a U.S. prison, case closed. But Eduardo had other plans. I cut a deal. He pled guilty, admitted to his role, and agreed to forfeit $50 million, which was an amount he could easily sacrifice compared to the billions owned by the cartel. So because he cooperated with U.S. authorities, he didn't serve the full 15 years. In August 2021, with time credited from his nearly 4 years in Mexican custody before extradition, plus good behavior, this guy walked out of a low-security prison in Pennsylvania after less than a decade of being locked up. For a guy who could have easily faced 140 years if they'd handed the max sentence to him, Eduardo considered himself really lucky. Now, you see, his brothers weren't so lucky. Benjamin got 25 years, Francisco Javier got life, and Ramon, well, he didn't make it out of that Mazatlan shootout. Eduardo's lighter sentence and early release already set him apart, but the real kicker was still coming. August 23, 2021 was the day Eduardo thought he would taste freedom. However, the U.S. deported him to Mexico and handed him over at the border in Matamoros. Now, Eduardo thought he'd probably just slip away and possibly live a quiet life somewhere with whatever cash he had stashed. But Mexico had other ideas. The second he crossed the border, federal authorities swoop in and arrest him again. Turns out they had a warrant for his arrest on charges of organized crime and drug trafficking in their country. He was then taken to the max security Altiplano prison. So he outlived his U.S. sentence, but it looks like Ed here has more crimes to pay for in his home country. August 26, 2014, Jean Popeye Vasquez was released from prison, leaving everyone wondering how this notorious sicario tied to over 3,000 deaths could simply step back into the world. Jean Jairo Popeye Velasquez Vasquez wasn't just any cartel member. This guy was Pablo Escobar's right-hand man, a key player in the Medellin cartel's reign of terror during the 1980s and early 90s. He confessed to personally killing 300 people and orchestrating the murders of thousands more, including the 1989 assassination of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán. Now, his criminal history included terrorism, drug trafficking, extortion, and even the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, which claimed 110 lives. In 1992, he surrendered to Colombian authorities, facing a 30-year sentence, the maximum under the country's laws, since life sentences and the death penalty didn't exist there. But here's where it gets interesting. He didn't serve the full 30 years. After 23 years and 3 months, he walks out on parole. His release stunned victims' families and sparked outrage across Colombia. Because you see, Velasquez played the system like a pro. Colombian law allows sentence reductions for good behavior, work, and study. And he took full advantage. While locked up, he studied, cooperated with authorities on high-profile cases, like testifying against a former justice minister tied to Galán's murder, and stayed out of trouble, at least by prison standards. By August 26, 2014, having served 3/5 of his sentence, Velasquez qualified for probation. But it wasn't smooth sailing. His time inside included armed clashes at La Modelo prison in 2000 and 2001. But outside, his story got even wilder. Velasquez reinvented himself. This guy launched a YouTube channel titled Popeye Arrepentido, which translates to Remorseful Popeye. He then gained over 1 million subscribers as he ranted about politics, mafia tales, and even a narco corrido about his life. That's not all, though. Though many had doubted his sincerity, Velasquez also wrote a memoir titled Surviving Pablo Escobar, where he spilled secrets and claimed redemption. However, controversy followed fast. By 2016, he was caught on video firing a gun in Medellin streets. Then in 2018, he landed right back in prison for extortion and was accused of blackmailing Escobar's old associates. On January 8, 2020, Velasquez was diagnosed with terminal esophageal cancer and died at age 57 on February 6, 2020 in Bogota.
Mexico is claiming another victory in its drug war. The fugitive known as the Barbie is under arrest.
November 2022, Edgar Valdez Villarreal, aka La Barbie, mysteriously vanished from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons database, sparking some wild speculation about how a cartel kingpin sentenced to 49 years could slip out of custody. Villarreal's story starts in Laredo, Texas, as a regular kid with blue eyes and a knack for football. His high school coach gave him the nickname La Barbie because he looked like a Ken doll. By his teens, Villarreal was dealing weed, and after dodging a marijuana indictment in the late 90s, he fled to Mexico. Now there he climbed the deadly ladder of the drug trade, hooking up with the Beltran Leyva cartel, and later aligning with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's Sinaloa cartel. Villarreal wasn't just moving cocaine hundreds of kilos at a time into cities like Atlanta and Memphis. This guy was a top-level enforcer, leading Los Negros, the Beltran Leyva's hit squad. He would turn violence into an art form as he recorded torture sessions and left decapitated bodies everywhere during brutal turf wars with the Zetas and Gulf Cartel. By 2009, with a $2.3 million bounty on his head, he was one of Mexico's most wanted criminals. August 31, 2010, Mexican authorities arrest Villarreal near Mexico City after a firefight. Interestingly, as they took him away, he kept a smile on his face as if he was enjoying it all. Villarreal was extradited to the U.S., where he pled guilty in 2016 to drug trafficking and money laundering. In June 2018, a judge in Atlanta sentenced him to 49 years and a month in prison, plus a $192 million forfeiture. At 44 years old, that sentence didn't guarantee him seeing freedom again. And he would land at USP Coleman II, a max security prison in Florida, but was later extradited to continue his sentence in Mexico. While this should have been the end of it, there's more to the story. In November 2022, Villarreal's name disappeared from the BOP online roster, listed as not in BOP custody, after just barely 4 years in jail. Now, a lot of people were thinking that he escaped like one of El Chapo's legendary prison breaks. Even Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador demanded answers. But the BOP made the matter even more confusing. They stated that inmates can be out of custody for court hearings, medical reasons, or other reasons, but offered no specifics. No one believed the BOP on this one because inmates don't just vanish for a checkup. Rumors then started spreading that Villarreal had probably cut a deal to turn informant to shave off some years. But then this is where it gets interesting. You see, he wasn't new to snitching. Back in 2010, while still in Mexican custody, he accused top officials, including ex-security chief Genaro Garcia Luna, of taking cartel bribes. This revelation later led to Garcia Luna's 2019 arrest in Texas. Now, some also claim that he tipped off U.S. authorities about his old boss, Arturo Beltran Leyva, and that was tied to the kingpin's death by Mexican Marines in 2009. At the same time, though, people also speculate that cooperating with authorities could have been the reason for his lesser sentence of just 49 years. While the sentence seemed justified, it is lighter than life terms handed to peers like El Chapo. So, his name disappearing from the BOP roster might have been the payoff. A quiet release or transfer to witness protection, with his identity scrubbed for safety.
Cárdenas Guillén, ex líder del Cártel del Golfo, llegó a un acuerdo con las autoridades estadounidenses.
2003, Ociel Cárdenas was arrested after a shootout with Mexican military and then was extradited to the U.S. Now, while he was given a lengthy jail term, no one expected what happened next. Ociel Cárdenas Guillén wouldn't be another cartel member. This guy was the kingpin of the Gulf Cartel and the mastermind behind how Los Zetas, a crew of ex-special commandos turned hitmen, broke away from the Gulf Cartel. Now, the Zetas is regarded as the most bloodthirsty gang of hitmen Mexico has ever known. In fact, Guillén was nicknamed El Mata Amigos, which means the friend killer, after allegedly murdering a rival to seize power. Captured in 2003 after a shootout in Matamoros, Guillén was extradited to the U.S. 4 years later. Then, in 2010, he got a 25-year sentence for drug trafficking, money laundering, and threatening federal agents, as well as crimes tied to moving tons of drugs and millions of dollars across borders. Guillén was first incarcerated at ADX Florence, where he was isolated from interacting with other prisoners. But then he was transferred to USP Florence High and finally to USP Terre Haute. Interestingly, Guillén didn't serve the full stretch though. On August 30th, 2024, after about 17 years behind bars, including time in Mexico before extradition, he was out. handed over to US's ICE, and later deported to Mexico. Now, no one knows for sure why Guillen didn't serve his entire sentence. But for one, the US system sometimes cuts years off for good behavior or cooperation. Some others say he might have traded in some secrets. Aside from this, though, nearly $30 million of his assets got split among Texas law enforcement, hinting at a deal. However, Guillen's freedom wouldn't last long. December 16, 2024, he was handed over to Mexican authorities at the Tijuana border, where he now faces charges that could stack up to 730 years. Guillen's now locked up in Mexico's Altiplano prison, where he's still a legend at 57. Also, since he reportedly kept the Gulf Cartel running while in prison in the U.S. by scribbling orders on notes passed through lawyers and guards, he is believed to still be doing the same.
Desde su captura en abril de 1989, ha pasado 32 años preso. ¿Cómo está su salud?
Mi salud es pésima. Mi familia está haciendo un hoyo para yo ser enterrado en un árbol.
April 8, 1989, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the infamous El Jefe de Jefes, boss of bosses, was arrested in his bathrobe and then was given over 70 years in prison. Due to his age, everyone thought Gallardo would just die in jail until he pulled a stunt that just shocked everyone. Born January 8, 1946 on a ranch in Bella Vista, Sinaloa, Felix Gallardo graduated from high school and studied business in college. However, shortly after his graduation, he started working for drug traffickers, helping them bribe state officials. Then, together with Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, they would form the Guadalajara Cartel and take control of Pedro Aviles Perez's trafficking routes, after the latter was killed in a police shootout. April 8, 1989, Gallardo was arrested for orchestrating the murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena and was given 40 years in prison. In addition to that, he got another 37-year term in 2017 after a retrial. At 43, when he went in, it meant that he wouldn't be out until he was over 100 years old. And that was if he was lucky to be alive by then. That was because, according to Gallardo himself, his health wasn't too good. He was blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, and had undergone 8 hernia surgeries. Oh, and he also had an issue with one of his arms after a fatal fall. Nevertheless, while incarcerated at the Altiplano Max Security Prison, Gallardo kept his influence alive, reportedly running the Guadalajara Cartel via his phone in the early years. But he would also adapt to his current circumstances by splitting his empire amongst trusted lieutenants like the Arellano Felix brothers and Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, before tighter security cut his strings in 1993. Gallardo's lack of control over the other drug lords then resulted in the Guadalajara Cartel dividing into what is now known as the Sinaloa, Tijuana, Juarez, and Pacifico Sur cartels. March 2013, as a result of his worsening health, Gallardo started appealing for his sentence to be commuted to house arrest on his 70th birthday in 2016. Because you see, aside from his health problems, Gallardo was confined to a very tiny cell, which he wasn't allowed to leave, not even to use the recreational area. However, his plea was rejected many times on grounds that there wasn't enough evidence to prove that his health issues were putting his life at risk. September 12, 2022, a judge finally ruled in his favor. At this time, Gallardo was already confined to a wheelchair and had served 33 years of the original 40, which meant he still had another 44 to go. Now, being placed on house arrest at 76 isn't actually freedom, but Gallardo was initially staring down decades in Mexico's worst prisons, so it was kind of a victory that only a few could pull off. In fact, with his complicated health challenges, coming out alive after the time he served behind bars was a shock to many.
Alias El Lobo, testificó en contra de Genaro García Luna allá en la corte de Brooklyn, en Nueva York, y delató a rivales y exaliados del cártel de Sinaloa y de otros cárteles como en el que él lideraba, el del Milenio.
February 2023, Oscar Nava Valencia testified against Mexico's ex-security chief, Genaro García Luna, Unknown to anyone though, Valencia was only trying to play the justice system because he had other plans. Oscar Nava Valencia came from a humble background, with his family being avocado farmers from Tamaulipas. However, in the late 70s, the Valencia family established the deadly Cartel de los Valencia, or the Milenio Cartel, as they started to grow cannabis and opium poppy in Jalisco and Michoacán, and would sell them to bigger cartels. Fast forward to the 90s, and they'd grown connections with the infamous Medellin Cartel. 2003, Valencia, alongside other close relatives, became the leader of the Milenio Cartel after the arrest of his uncle, Armando Valencia Cornelio. Around this time, the group had expanded so much that they were shipping cocaine from Central and South America right through Mexico to the U.S. And fun fact, it was from this cartel that the Jalisco New Generation Cartel was born. October 28, 2009. Valencia was arrested after a shootout with the Mexican army in Guadalajara and then extradited to the U.S. 2 years later. In 2014, a federal judge in Houston sentenced him to 25 years in prison for conspiracy to distribute cocaine after smuggling a 3,100-kilogram load of cocaine from Panama. Now, this should have kept him behind bars until he was a very old man, assuming he even make it that long. But Valencia had other plans, and it wouldn't involve growing old in a cell. From the moment he was caught in Mexico, he knew it was in his best interest to cooperate with the U.S. authorities. In fact, Valencia really wouldn't fight his extradition. As his lawyers later said, he decided in Mexico to spill everything he could. He would plead guilty to drug trafficking charges for a reduced sentence, to avoid another charge of direct cocaine distribution in the U.S. Valencia soon became a key witness, dishing out dirt on former allies and enemies alike. February 2023 would be his biggest moment during the trial of Genaro Garcia Luna, Mexico's ex-security chief. Valencia testified that he personally handed over $10 million to Garcia Luna to free a seized drug shipment in 2007. He also admitted to chipping in $2.5 million for a cartel co-op bribe in 2006, painting a picture of a really corrupt system. That revelation proved crucial to the case, and it helped nail Garcia Luna, who got 38 years in prison. Interestingly, this wasn't Valencia's first win toward making his incarceration as easy as possible. You see, his 25-year sentence had already been slashed to 200 months, equivalent to about 16 years in 2019. But that's not all. The U.S. even counted his time in Mexican jail toward that total. His lawyers also argued that he was a model inmate who was taking regular Bible classes, going to Mass, and claiming he wanted to be a better man for his family. But then it would be his snitching that really helped the case. And testifying against heavy hitters like Garcia Luna was the final piece. November 27, 2023, Valencia walks free after 12 years of being locked up. At the time, he was likely to remain in the U.S. as part of a protected witness program, along with his wife and children. Valencia was also to remain at the disposal of the DOJ to cooperate in future cases.
El nariz operaba en varias localidades del Estado de México y se le atribuyen amenazas a dueños de negocios mediante la imposición de cuotas y el uso de armas de fuego. Además, la Fiscalía...
January 7th, 2024. Mario Hidalgo Arguello, a notorious Sinaloa cartel member known as El Nariz, was handed over to Mexican authorities. But instead of serving a long jail term, this guy knew what he had to do. Mario was a trusted errand boy for Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, that infamous Sinaloa cartel kingpin. And in February 2014, Hidalgo was arrested in Culiacan, Mexico during a raid, and it didn't take long before he switched sides. He spilled secrets on stash houses, tunnels, and cartel hideouts, giving the authorities a gold mine of intel. In fact, Hidalgo played a crucial role in the arrest of El Chapo, as he led Mexican Marines and a U.S. drug agent to the safe house where the drug lord was hiding. But he narrowly escaped through a tunnel under a bathtub. And less than a week later, El Chapo was successfully arrested. October 2020, Hidalgo was extradited to the U.S. to face charges of trafficking 6 tons of marijuana on a yacht into San Diego in 2012. He pled guilty, and in December 2021, a Southern California judge hands him a 7-year sentence instead of the mandatory minimum term of 10 years. Now, many thought this was an injustice. It was expected that Hidalgo would at least complete his sentence. At 46 years old, this guy was looking at being locked up until at least 2028, assuming good behavior might shave off a little time. But here's where it gets wild. He only served 3 years before he was out of prison and in ICE custody, ready to be shipped back to Mexico. January 7th, 2024, ICE hands him over to Mexican authorities at the border. Officially, he completed his U.S. prison term, or at least enough to satisfy the system. But people are still shocked as to how that happened. Now, some say that it was credit for his time served. Hidalgo had been in custody since his 2014 arrest in Mexico, and while awaiting extradition until 2020, he might have racked up years that counted toward his U.S. sentence. The U.S. justice system sometimes credits pre-trial detention, especially in extradition cases, if the defendant was held on related charges. Aside from that, his quick release would also hint at a deal. His history of cooperating after his 2014 arrest suggested that he knew how to play around the justice system. You see, prosecutors love the rat who can help dismantle a bigger operation, and Hidalgo, who was El Chapo's right-hand runner, had plenty to offer. However, back in Mexico, Hidalgo wasn't exactly free. According to ICE, there was a possibility of him facing additional criminal prosecution in Mexico, which meant his outliving the U.S. sentence didn't erase his past. And as a result, Mexico could still hit him with charges tied to his Sinaloa days, which included drug trafficking and maybe even violence.